I started writing 13 years ago, and I've now published 4 fantasy novels. But there are 10 big things I wish I knew before I started my first book. Because if I knew these things earlier, I would have made much faster progress with my writing, and I would have avoided some big mistakes. The first thing I wish I knew was to gamify the process by using a tracker. I started writing in 2013, and in 2018, so 5 years into my writing career, I started using a writing tracker, where at the end of every day's writing session, I would open up a spreadsheet and I would write in the project I worked on, the amount of words I wrote that day, and how long I'd actually spent writing. And this was insane in terms of improving my motivation, my consistency, and just my overall joy I had around writing. That's because after every day's writing session, when I would successfully write, it would give me this kind of green highlight over that particular day. And soon enough, you build up this chain of green highlighted boxes in a row, and you don't want to break the chain. So there have been so many days over the years where I haven't really felt like writing, but I've thought about that chain that I've built up in my spreadsheet, and I've said to myself, I can't break that chain. I have to do something, even if it's just 5 words, 10 words, just a couple of minutes of writing. And it has been crazy the number of times when I've gone into my book just intending to do 1 or 2 sentences purely to maintain that chain. And all of a sudden, new ideas pop into my head. And before I know it, 30 minutes have passed, an hour has passed, 2 hours has passed. And I've written like 500 or 1,000 words when I didn't initially feel like it. And the science behind why this is so useful is the same reason why a lot of video games are addictive. A video game like Pokemon, for instance, makes it fun to be out in the long grass and just battling these low-level Pokemon in order to increase your own Pokemon's levels. You're basically having fun doing a really tedious task. If you think about what writing is, writing a long book might take you a year, it might take you a couple of years. And if you are just relying on the excitement of finishing a project, you get that one time and it comes a few years down the path. If you're able to, every single day after you finish writing, just put down how many words you wrote and how long you worked on your writing, and it gives you that nice little green tick of approval, it is chunking up the reward of writing a novel and bringing it forward into the present. So rather than waiting for a year to get that reward of typing the end, you're able to every single day feel like you're making meaningful progress towards your goals. I've actually given this writing tracker spreadsheet to a lot of the writers that I've worked with, or the writers inside my Fantasy Writers Guild, which is my community for writers. They all have this spreadsheet, and it is insane how many times it leads to them writing so much more than they expected, purely because they don't want to break the chain and because they want to fill out this spreadsheet to look as good as possible. So this is really something that you should set up immediately after watching this video. Set up a writing tracker spreadsheet if you don't already have it, and you'll be amazed at the amount of difference it makes to your motivation and productivity levels. I really wish I'd started it sooner. Okay, so the second thing I wish I knew before writing my first book is to understand what the purpose of your first book is all about. Your number one goal when you're writing your first book is to learn how to enjoy the process of writing as much as possible. Not to worry about whether it'll be published, not to worry about what people will think or how many copies it's going to sell, or even if it's good. That might sound strange, but you've got to realize that your first novel is all about setting up that foundation of joy and excitement towards writing. So write about the stuff that fascinates you. Write about the things that keep you up at night, the things that make you angry, the things that you love. If you're having fun, then you are winning. Of course, there's going to be times with even the most fun project where writing your book is going to suck and it's going to be hard. But always try to focus on the fun as much as possible. So make your characters say the things that you wish you'd said. Write about the magic that you wish existed in the world. Create the coolest action scenes that you can possibly imagine, because unlike a movie, you have an unlimited budget for special effects. Take your weird obsessions and your hobbies and all the meaningful experiences of your life and scramble them up into this creative soup so that you can transmute them into something fresh and exciting with your storytelling. If you can do that, if you can really just focus hard on trying to enjoy the process of writing as much as possible with the first novel, then that's going to set you up with the foundation for an immensely enjoyable life as a writer. Fall in love with the process of writing, not the outcome. The third thing I wish I'd known before writing my first fantasy novel is to write backwards from the ending. Your ending has the biggest emotional impact on your reader. You can have a story where the first 90% of the book is amazing, but then there's a really crappy last 10%, and it's going to mean that the entire book in the reader's mind instantly becomes crappy. On the other hand, you can have a story that's so-so, it's kind of all right for the first 90%, but that last 10%, the ending, just absolutely blows the reader's mind, and all of a sudden you might have a 5 out of 5 story. So when you work backwards from the ending, when you know where your story is heading towards, it allows you to then go back into the beginning of your story, into the middle of your story, and set up the most interesting journey possible towards that intended outcome. So if you know at the end of your book, your character is going to become brave and he's going to become really skilled with this magic, then you can work backwards to chapter 1 and you can show him being really cowardly, or you can show him not being very competent with this magic and feeling like a failure. That then gives you this really interesting character arc to take him on across the course of the story. And this was the big mistake that I made with my first fantasy novel, right? So the first book I wrote, The Aeon Academy, was this sort of middle grade superhero urban fantasy story about this young boy who discovers he has powers, goes to this school for superheroes, and I just wrote that thing from page 1. I didn't really know where my ending was, and I only really came up with the ending a few weeks before writing it. And as a result, it just felt like it was really lacking in cohesion, and it didn't really make a lot of sense. And that meant I had to go back and I had to rewrite the story from scratch a couple of times in order to try and make it all work. That is a really big mistake to avoid in my mind. And so that's why when I moved on to writing my second book, Across the Broken Stars, which I published, I actually came up with the ending really early on. It was probably something I thought about literally within the first 30 minutes of beginning to brainstorm ideas for this book. And as a result, I think it meant for a much more cohesive and enjoyable writing process because I knew where everything was going. And by knowing where my intended payoff for the story was, I was then able to work backwards and set up the proper promise and the proper progress towards that payoff earlier on in the story. When you do that in your own writing, when you work backwards from the ending, it just makes everything much more cohesive. It also means that you can look like a genius with your foreshadowing, because if you know that in the climax of the story, your character is going to exploit this aspect of the magic system in order to defeat the villain, then you're able to work backwards earlier in the story and show little clues to set up that possible intended use at the ending. So as an author, working backwards from your ending means that you are kind of like a time traveler. You know where the future is going, and so you can then look like a genius in the past because you're able to go back and set up these details to make that future work really well. Speaking about knowing the future, this brings me to the fourth thing that I really wish I had known when I started writing my first book, which is outlining is amazing. I've talked about this a lot on this channel before, but I genuinely cannot recommend this enough. With my first book, I just wrote it by the seat of my pants. There was no plan. I just made things up as I went along, and it was a lot of fun. And again, like, you want to focus on the fun with the first book, so I don't necessarily consider that a failure by any means, but because I had no cohesive plan and I didn't really know where the story was going, it meant that I was just sitting down every day and trying to ask myself, okay, well, what do the characters do next? What happens in the story? And it led to a lot of randomness with my storytelling and my plotting, and it meant that things didn't always cohesively come together in quite the way I would have liked. Again, this was something I changed when I was writing Across the Broken Stars. I outlined this story pretty extensively. I probably spent maybe a couple of weeks on the outline for this, and as a result, I was able to write the first draft of this in 60 days, as opposed to my first book, The Aeon Academy, which took me 360 days to write the first draft because I had no plan. If you want to go through my outlining process in more detail, check out this video over here where I go through the hourglass outlining method, which is what I've used for all of my subsequent stories. And I've also taught this method in 4 cohorts of my fantasy outlining bootcamp, which is like the 7-week program where I take small groups of writers through the outlining process. And honestly, one of the proudest achievements, I would say, over the last few years for me has been teaching this outlining method to my students and seeing it help them like actually finish their first books after struggling. For instance, I remember Arwen, one of my bootcamp students, he was struggling, around the 20,000, 30,000 word mark of his books. He would always sort of give up and abandon them at that point because he didn't really know what would happen next. Went through my outlining bootcamp, and then a few months later, finished the first draft of his book. And the big realization that I think I've been able to give to a lot of my students, and hopefully you have as well if you've been watching the videos on this channel for long enough, is the fact that outlining isn't limiting to you. It doesn't restrict your creativity. It actually lets you explore more possible versions of what your story could be. Rather than just writing one version and only being able to explore that one version, once you learn how to outline effectively, you can spend a week exploring 7 different versions of your story, right? And that allows you to then figure out what is the best angle or what is the best path for me to actually go down. The 5th big thing I wish I'd known before I started writing my first book, and I'm kind of laughing here because this is a particularly painful one, is to not compare your first draft to the finished, published novel written by an author you love who has worked at this craft for 20 years. I remember starting out like feeling some real moments of despair, where I would look back through something I wrote, and when I was writing it, I thought, oh, this is amazing. This is going to be so good. I can't wait until they turn this into a movie, right? And then I would read back over it, and it was just kind of crap, right? Like, it didn't really feel the way it had in my mind. There was a gap between my sense of taste and my skill at actually bringing my own creation to life. And then I would read other books by authors I admired, and I would kind of just feel a little bit depressed, right? Because I look at how good their writing is, how snappy their dialogue felt, how cool their world building was, how just interesting their ideas were. And I would look at where I was and I would feel this massive yawning chasm. And it seemed genuinely impossible to overcome that, right? But the thing is, you have to just tell yourself that it's not about comparing you to Brandon Sanderson or to Tolkien or insert whatever other author you admire here. It is about comparing who you are now, today, to who you were yesterday. And simply focusing on every single time you show up to write, just asking yourself the question of, how do I get 1% better at this craft? Not how do I go from struggling author who doesn't know how to put a scene together to how do I instantly write, like a massive 10-book series like Brandon Sanderson is going to write with Cosmere. It is more about asking yourself, okay, today, what is something I can work on? This is something that comes up whenever I play tennis with my mate Irfan. To give a bit of a sporting example here. Every session, we usually ask each other at the start of it, what's the one thing you're working on today? And sometimes it'll be, I want to make sure that I'm getting more side on so that I can get more power through. I want to make sure I'm coming into the net more to improve my volleys. And just having that ability to, at the start of every writing session, sit down and just say, okay, I'm going to work on making my dialogue more concise today, or I'm going to add more subtext to my dialogue. Or maybe it's, I am going to work on improving my setting descriptions. Maybe I over-rely too much on sight, so I'm going to try to have more smell-based setting descriptions or more sound-based setting descriptions instead to change it up a little bit. If you can do that every single day when you sit down to write, you're going to be amazed at the improvements that stack up over time. This is something in particular that I really focused hard on in my early years as a writer. Just every time I would sit down to write, what is one thing I'm going to get better at? And over time, if you compound this over weeks, months, years, a decade, you'll be stunned at how much you improve. So again, it's not about comparing who you are right now to, your favorite author's writing. It is about comparing yourself to who you were yesterday and just focusing on those 1% improvements. The sixth thing I wish I'd known before I started writing my first book is to write to your strengths. If you crush dialogue scenes and you're just so good at writing that witty back and forth banter between your characters, but you really struggle to write long setting descriptions, or you really struggle to write long travel sequences because it's just kind of boring to you, then maybe don't design your story around long travel sequences and long setting descriptions. Instead, maybe design a story where your characters are all kind of in the same location and there's lots of opportunity for them to bounce off each other with their dialogue and to be constantly talking. I remember having this realization earlier in my own writing. I had written a book called The Sands of Truth where it was a lot of one character wandering around a desert and reflecting, ruminating, just having a lot of internal contemplation. And I think there was a lot of things that were working really well with that story. But I came off the end of that project feeling a little bit exhausted because I felt like I had been sort of stretching myself and not really writing stuff that I had deeply connected with. Ironically now, I think I would be more interested in that kind of reflective, contemplative story, so I'll probably go back to it at one point. But I remember coming off that project and just asking myself, okay, how can I make this more fun for myself? Like, what can I do with the next book where I can just be putting in all the things that I am really good at and that I find really fun to make it as easy and enjoyable as possible? So I literally sat down and I wrote out all of the tropes that I really found myself gravitating towards at the time. So I realized I don't want to tell a story where characters are traveling between locations. I want to tell a story where they're in one city. I used to be an architect, so I love talking about architecture. I love the things that you can consider when it comes to urban design in your storytelling. Okay, I want that to be a big focus. I also want it to be fast-paced. I don't want it to be a story that takes place over months or years, which was kind of what the previous project had been. Okay, I want something that's more faster paced. I want something that's set in one location. I don't want it to just be one character by themselves as much. I want it to be more of an ensemble story with a cast of characters so that there's opportunities for conflict between them, for banter, for lots of good dialogue, for them to influence each other's growth in interesting ways. And there were a bunch of other things that I listed out as well in that brainstorm. And as a result, that led to The Thunder Heist, which to this day is the easiest and maybe the most fun book I've ever written. It took me 47 days to write the first draft, and the first draft of this was pretty much how the final draft is, in terms of not really needing to add more scenes, not really having a ton of issues to fix. It came out as this really fast-paced thing. It was set in one location. You can kind of see here on the cover, it's set in this floating city ship made from thousands of boats all lashed together on this monster-infested sea, and it was just a blast to write. And so, of course, you want to work on improving your weaknesses as a writer, but don't Force yourself to write stuff that you know you're not going to gravitate towards. If you know that there's certain aspects of writing that you do really well with, then maybe try to design your story around that. It's going to make the process easier, and it's going to lead to a story that is a lot better to read. The seventh thing I wish I'd known before I started writing my first book is how structure works, both at a scene level and at a wider story level. With my first book, The Aeon Academy, I didn't really understand structure at all. And as a result, my story was just sort of loose and shapeless. It meant that a lot of the chapters just felt like my characters were sort of milling around. There wasn't really much purpose to things. There wasn't as much forward progression in the plot as I would have liked. Things were just sort of happening in a random way. It meant that a lot of the book was just this sort of, nebulous middle slog. And then I realized, oh, I need to end it. And the ending felt really rushed. If I had known structure then and how to structure my stories correctly, it would have improved my pacing a lot, and it would have given me a much better scaffold to go through that process so that I wasn't feeling as lost. So the structure I like to use these days after writing a bunch of books is 9-point story structure. I go through this in much more detail in my upcoming nonfiction book, Plotting Your Fantasy Novel, which is currently with my early readers, getting a ton of feedback from them right now, which is amazing. You can sign up to the waitlist by going to jedherne.com/plot, and I'll email you when the book is released if you would like to go through the book. Basically condenses everything I've learned from 13 years of writing, so if you made it this far in the video, I know you'll find it useful. But to give a brief overview of 9-point story structure right now, the key points to consider here are your opening hook. So this is all about introducing your protagonist with a defining moment that establishes why we should actually give a damn about them, why we should care about them, show their flaws, show their desires, and ideally set up their character arc. So set up the change and transformation they're going to go through in story. Your second point is your inciting incident. This is all about disturbing your main character's ordinary world by presenting them with some kind of challenge or invitation that disrupts the status quo and forces them to go on some kind of journey. Might be like a physical quest, or it might be more of like an internal quest within them. Our third point is the entering the new realm moment, which is where your protagonist crosses some kind of threshold and they step into a new world where the rules are different. This leads to the fourth point, your rising danger moment, which is all about showing the danger of the antagonist, the threat that they present, and ideally showing how your antagonist is uniquely skilled at attacking your main character's specific weaknesses. We're actually going to get to antagonists a bit later in this video as well. Our fifth point here is the midpoint revelation. So this is the centerpiece of your story, and it's all about giving your protagonist an important epiphany about themselves or about the nature of the opposition they're facing in order to kind of make them more personally attached to the story. Our sixth moment is the deepening pressure point. This is where your antagonist again applies amplified pressure to your main character, and it really forces your main character into this dark night of the soul, all is lost moment where everything seems hopeless. Our seventh point is the final spark. So just when everything seems lost, your protagonist encounters a key realization or a clue that provides the final puzzle piece they need to defeat the antagonist. And as a result, they then set forth for the final confrontation with that antagonist. It should be noted here, even though they're getting this sort of puzzle piece or clue, it doesn't mean the final confrontation is going to be easy. In fact, it's going to be the hardest battle of their life so far. This brings us to the climax, the final confrontation between your protagonist and antagonist, resolving the core conflict of your story. Again, this should be the moment of maximum struggle for your main character. If you're writing a positive arc where your character wins, this is the moment where they vanquish the antagonist. And then lastly, you have your closing image. So this is all about resolving the story, showing how your protagonist has changed. Often you'll contrast that with your opening image to really dramatize that transformation. And then this finishes off the book. Again, I go through this 9-point story structure in much more detail in Plotting Your Fantasy Novel, so definitely check it out if you want a deeper breakdown. Now, in terms of scene structure, it took me a few years of writing to really discover and really understand what scene structure actually is. But it's so important to know, and I really wish I had known it earlier because it would have just given so much more shape and purpose to my daily writing. Because knowing how to structure your scenes correctly is going to mean that you never feel lost about knowing what to write next. Scene structure is going to give you this tremendously useful guide to help you know exactly what to put down on the page. Okay, so in terms of structuring your scenes, you've got two types of scenes. You've got action scenes and you've got response scenes. Action scenes are made up of 3 steps. First of all, we have your goal, which is what does your character want? Second, we have the conflict, which is what's stopping them from getting their goal. And then lastly, we have the resolution, which is what happens. Does the character get the goal? Does the character not get the goal? Does something else happen entirely? This then leads into your response scene. So your response scene first starts with a reaction. How does your character feel about the resolution that just happened? This leads to a dilemma. As a result of that resolution, what choice does your character now face? And then next we have the decision. So what is the new goal that your character picks to pursue? And then this leads back into the next action scene. So you can see here how your story is literally just comprised of this endless loop of goal, conflict, resolution, reaction, dilemma, decision, goal, conflict, resolution, and so forth. And you can write a whole story that way, just looping one action scene into a response scene, one after another, all the way through your book. Again, much more detail about scene structure and a lot of examples in plotting your fantasy novel, so check out the waitlist by clicking the link in the description or going to jedherne.com/plot if you want to be emailed when it's ready. The 8th big thing I wish I had known before I started writing my first fantasy book is what theme actually is. When I started out as a writer, I kind of knew theme in like the high school English class sense of the word, where it's like, the theme of this story is love, or the theme of this story is anger, or the theme of this story is war. And that never really made me think of theme as a meaningful thing, right? It made me just think that it's this vague subject matter and there's not really that much relevance of knowing it. But as I went through my writing and I read a ton of books on the craft, I discovered this definition of theme that really resonated with me, which is this idea that theme is a moral argument about how to live. I think I first found that definition in The Anatomy of Story by John Truby, which is a really good book. And as I've been reflecting on theme a bit more recently, like literally in the last couple of months, as I've been plotting a fantasy novel, I've realized that it's actually probably more useful to break theme down into 2 components. First of all, you have your thematic statement, which is a specific moral argument about how life works. So for instance, money is the root of all evil. And then you also have your thematic question, which relates to the same moral argument. So in this case, the thematic question might be, does money lead to corruption and evil? And knowing both your thematic statement and your thematic question, it just gives you a lot of interesting ideas to explore in your story. It means that your story is not just exploring surface level conflict, but it's actually exploring philosophical conflict. It's exploring something that's a bit deeper and more meaningful. The ultimate purpose of knowing theme with your story is not to cram a particular idea down readers' throats. Theme is not about preaching. Rather, it is about giving readers interesting questions to ponder. That's the role of a storyteller. It's not to give you the answers, it's to raise the questions. And so this is why with your theme, you really want to be developing it and exploring it from lots of different sides in your story. So your main character might express one particular interpretation on your theme, but then the antagonist might show the opposite. And then a mentor character might show something different. And then a love interest might show something different again. The reason why it's so useful to understand theme and why I wish I'd known about it earlier is that it just gives you tremendous clarity and cohesion with your story. When you know what your story is about at its core, when you know your theme, it means that you're never going to find yourself questioning which direction to take your plot or which direction to develop your characters, because you can just look at your theme and go, okay, well, out of these 2 pathways I'm considering, which one explores my theme better? Right, I'm going with that pathway. So it gives you this really useful filter for major creative decisions. It also means that your level of cohesion goes right up, because now you're not going to have things happening in your story just randomly. Everything will ideally be relating back to the theme. Again, it's not meaning that everything needs to have the same interpretation towards your theme. If anything, it should be the opposite. You should be using different elements of your characters, your plot, your world building, etc., to explore your theme from lots of different angles to create that really juicy philosophical conflict and thought-provokingness in your book. To give you a couple of examples here, if we look at The Hobbit, I would say the thematic statement for this story is that true courage and growth come only from facing the unknown and embracing change. The thematic question is, how can ordinary people find extraordinary courage? If we look at A Game of Thrones by George R. R. Martin, I would say the thematic statement is that honor is a foolish weakness in a world where power rewards ruthlessness and deception. And then the thematic question is, can an honorable man survive in a dishonorable world? If we look at Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree, I would say the thematic statement is, true fulfillment comes from ignoring society's expectations and following your own passions. And then if we look at the thematic question for that book, I would say it is, are you willing to go against the crowd to follow your own passions? To give an example from my own stories, the first time I really brought theme into a book and really considered it as part of my process was when I was writing Across the Broken Stars. Back then, I only really thought about the thematic statement. I didn't really think about the thematic question as much. But my thematic statement for this book was that redemption is only possible by sacrificing yourself for an ideology that's bigger than you. And knowing that that's what my story was about at its core gave me so much rich philosophical material and conflict to dive into. And it meant that with all of my different characters and their different arcs and decisions, they could all relate back to that central theme to give me a tremendous amount of cohesion in my writing. The 9th thing I wish I'd known before I started writing my first book was how to design an antagonist properly. This is probably one of the biggest mistakes I made with the Aeon Academy. I only really came up with my main antagonist a couple of weeks before finishing the book. So in that first draft, he just pops in out of nowhere and just messes stuff up and then my main character defeats him. And it all felt like really messy and very rushed. But the thing is, your antagonist matters just as much, in some ways, maybe more than your main character, because your antagonist is going to be driving the conflict that your main character faces. They're going to be putting your main character into really difficult positions where they have to make choices that define their true nature. So the stronger the opposition that your main character has to overcome, the more interesting your main character gets. The main things to think about when it comes to designing great antagonists is to really try to craft your main character and your antagonist in sync. Try to find ways to design an antagonist who is uniquely gifted at attacking your main character's specific weaknesses. It's also really useful to try and create some kind of zero-sum competition between your protagonist and antagonist. So what I mean by that is that ideally you want them to be competing for the same type of goal, or you want their goals to be such that it's not possible for your protagonist to get what they want and for the antagonist to get what they want at the same time. Because if they can get what they want without really having to go through each other, then you're not really going to have collision between them. But if they both want this one thing, then you got collision. Or if your main character wants this one thing and your antagonist wants this other thing, but there's no way for them to both be achieved at the same time, then you also have collision. You want to also make your antagonist an overdog as much as possible. There's lots of different antagonist archetypes you can use, and I broke them down in this video over here talking about the big antagonist mistakes that new fantasy writers make. But if you're writing like a human antagonist, it's really good to make them more powerful in some way than your main character. Because if your main character is the one that's overpowered, then we're not going to really feel a sense of tension or threat when they're going up against the antagonist. You also want to give your antagonist a logical motivation. You don't want them to just be like evil for evil's sake, generally speaking. You want to make sure that what they're doing makes sense from their perspective. And you also want to make sure they're not making dumb decisions, like just letting your main character go for no reason or sparing your main character's life for no reason. And then the last thing to consider, the best antagonists are the ones that really pressure your main character into moral dilemmas, impossible decisions, really difficult, tricky choices. Because true character is revealed in the decisions a person makes under pressure, and the greater the pressure you can apply to them, then the more of their truth we're really going to see. And then the 10th and final thing I really wish I had known before writing my first book was this. Put all your energy as a writer into the next step before you, and nothing beyond it. It is so easy when you're writing to be distracted with thoughts of the next book you're going to work on, or how you're going to get it published, or what people are going to say. But all these concerns are distractions. The best way to get the outcomes you want as a writer is to be totally focused on the day's writing that is before you. And believe me, I've struggled with this big time. Like I remember when I was writing Siege of Trebelin a few years ago, so my interactive fantasy novel, and building all these different spreadsheets where I would calculate like, okay, if the game sells this many copies, this is the revenue I'm going to get. Or if it sells this many copies, I'm going to get this revenue instead. And every time I would do this, I would just realize like, Jed, you're an idiot. You just spent 20 minutes building this pointless spreadsheet that means nothing when you could have put that time into writing an interesting scene in this interactive story. You could have put that time into doing something that would actually get you the outcome you want. So ultimately, just focus on the next step. Enjoy the journey as much as possible. Focus on what lies before you and don't worry too much about the future. Just control what is in your control. Just orient yourself towards what you can control, which is, can I show up today and can I do a good day of writing? That's why I always end these videos the same way. Keep writing and keep striving, because ultimately, that's the most important thing that matters. I'll see you in the next video.